What if humanity once spoke a single language and nearly stormed heaven itself? After the flood, all of Noah's descendants shared one tongue, one purpose, one terrifying unity. In the plains of Shinar, they built something unprecedented, a tower designed to pierce the sky and challenge God directly. This wasn't just architecture, it was humanity's first act of collective rebellion against divine authority. In response, God shattered their language into 70 tongues, scattering them across the earth and changing the course of human civilization forever. You're about to discover how one tower's construction became the origin story of every nation on earth. In the beginning was the Word, and men spoke it with one voice across a world washed clean by divine judgment. Before the great tower pierced the sky in defiance of heaven, before human tongues were scattered like leaves in an autumn wind, before the sons of Adam learned that unity could become the most dangerous weapon of all, there was silence. Silence, and the sound of waters retreating from an earth scrubbed bare of every monument to human pride. 40 days and nights heaven had wept judgment upon creation. Yet now the great ark settled upon Ararat's peaks like a temple built by divine hands, creaking with the weight of salvation and second chances. From its open door emerged Noah, beard white as mountain snow, eyes holding depths that had witnessed the world's first ending. Behind him walked his wife, her face etched with the particular sorrow of mothers who survived their children, for she alone among womankind had watched an entire generation drown while her own sons drew breath. Shem stepped forth first among the brothers, his bearing marked by that peculiar gravity of eldest sons who know they will inherit both blessing and responsibility. Ham followed, restless energy crackling around him like summer lightning, his gaze already turning from the mountain's height toward horizons that beckoned with promises of freedom and adventure. Last came Japheth, whose children would one day spread across northern reaches of the earth, like stars seeking their ordained places in the cosmic dance. Standing upon that wind-swept height, they breathed air that had never known corruption, air cleansed by waters that had carried away every trace of the violence that once made the Creator's heart grieve. Below them stretched a landscape reborn, valleys carved fresh by torrents that could move mountains, plains swept clean of every tower and temple raised to human glory, rivers running in channels cut deep as wounds in virgin soil. Worship came first, as worship must when mortals glimpse the full measure of divine mercy. Noah's hands trembled, not with age, but with the awful weight of being chosen, as he raised an altar of unhewn stones. Upon that sacred place he offered burnt sacrifices of every clean beast, their smoke ascending straight into windless sky like visible prayers. Sweet savour rose to heaven's throne, and the Lord received what earth below could offer of thanksgiving and submission. Heaven's covenant followed, sealed not with earthly parchment, but with the bow of coloured light, stretched across storm-cleansed clouds. While earth remains, spoke the voice that commanded seas and numbered every star, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Never again would waters cover the world to destroy all flesh. This promise hung in crystalline air, like the first song of hope in a world learning to dream of tomorrows. But fathers must bless and curse. Such is the burden of those who shape the destinies of generations yet unborn. Noah's vineyard grew with supernatural vigor in soil enriched by catastrophe, its vines heavy with clusters that gleamed like jewels in air so pure, it seemed to magnify every color, every scent. Wine flowed from those grapes, carrying in its crimson depths all the sweetness and bitterness of survival bought with global death. When wine loosened the bonds of patriarchal dignity, Ham looked upon his father's nakedness and saw not a man worthy of honor, but flesh not ripe for mockery. While Shem and Japheth walked backward with reverent care, a garment stretched between them to shield their father's shame, Ham ventured forth with careless tongue to spread tales of the great patriarch's human frailty. Small seemed the transgression, a moment's irreverence, a son's casual disrespect. From such seemingly trivial failures, however, do history's great tragedies spring. Noah's awakening brought words heavy with prophetic weight. Cursed be Canaan, his voice echoed across peaks that had witnessed the world's drowning. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Shadows fell across the future with those words, marking battle lines that would endure through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through ages when bronze would yield to iron and iron to steel. Balance came with blessing as divine justice demands. Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, the patriarch continued, aged hands lifted towards skies where God's rainbow covenant still gleamed. Canaan shall serve him. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in Shem's tents. Each word wove itself into destiny's fabric, creating patterns that would govern all the generations streaming toward an unimaginable tomorrow. From Ararat's heights, the sons descended, carrying more than their father's blessing and curse. They bore the pure tongue that alone among earthly things had survived the flood unchanged. Every syllable still pulsed with creative power inherited from Eden's garden. When they spoke of light, shadows fled before their words. When they named the beasts, creatures recognized their God-given authority. When they called upon the Most High's name, elements themselves attended their voice. This was the language in which Adam had walked with his Maker in evening's cool, in which Seth called upon the Lord's name, in which Enoch conversed with divinity before being translated beyond death's reach. One tongue for one people. This would be their strength, and in days not yet dawned, their greatest peril. Generations multiplied with the desperate fertility of a world hungry for inhabitants. In post-flood air, where the vapor canopy that once shielded Earth was gone, but soil still remembered paradise, women bore children for centuries, their wombs blessed with fruitfulness that would astonish later ages. Men lived long enough to see empires rise from their own handiwork, to watch cities built by their great-great-grandchildren, to speak with voices carrying the authority of centuries across valleys, echoing with ever-growing multitudes. 70 grandsons of righteous Noah spread across the recovering earth, like seeds scattered by divine hand, each destined to father nations, to establish peoples, to plant languages that did not yet exist. From Arctic wastes to desert sands, from mountain fastnesses to island kingdoms, they would carry the blood of the flood's sole survivors. And still they remained one. One people, one voice, one tongue, speaking words that held the power of creation itself. Memory bound them more surely than any chain forged in earthly fire. How could they forget the flood when stones beneath their feet bore witness to waters that had covered the highest hills? How could they ignore the covenant when rainbow light still blazed across storm-cleansed skies? Remembering paradise lost and paradise drowned, they clung together with desperate unity, building their hopes upon shared survival's foundation. Little did they know that their very oneness would birth the greatest rebellion heaven had yet witnessed, that their unified tongue would speak words of challenge that would echo from earth to the throne of the Most High. For in the plain of Shinar, where rivers ran rich and soil called out for cities, human unity would discover its own terrifying power, and learn why the Creator had commanded them to scatter across the face of all the earth, Eastward they journeyed, drawn by rivers that sang promises in voices older than memory itself. Behind them, Ararat's peaks faded into morning mist like a dream half remembered upon waking, while ahead the horizon beckoned with mysteries that called to the restless hearts of men, through mountain passes carved by waters that had reshaped the world, across valleys where wildflowers bloomed in soil enriched by catastrophe. The children of Noah followed paths that seemed to lead toward destiny itself. At their head strode Nimrod, son of Cush, grandson of accursed Ham, yet blessed or cursed, with strength that made giants seem like children playing at war. His shadow fell long across the morning earth, and where his feet touched ground, followers gathered like iron drawn to lodestone. Here walked a man who had never known defeat, whose very presence commanded attention from beast and human alike. Even eagles wheeling in the vast sky above seemed to pause in their flight when his voice echoed across the wilderness. Not for us the scattered life our grandfather ordained, he declared to the multitudes that trailed behind him like the wake of some great ship. Why should we spread ourselves thin across a hostile world when together we possess power enough to reshape creation according to our will? His words carried the dangerous music of rebellion, wrapped in reason, the sweet poison of ambition disguised as wisdom. Months of wandering brought them to a sight that stopped every heart and stilled every tongue. Before them stretched a plain so vast that earth itself seemed to curve away into infinity, where the great rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, meandered through landscape so fertile it appeared to pulse with green life. Here was abundance beyond the dreams of men, accustomed to wresting sustenance from reluctant soil. Date palms grew wild as weeds. Grain sowed itself in furrows carved by wind and rain, and the very air shimmered with the richness of a land that begged to be claimed. "Behold," breathed Nimrod, his voice carrying across the assembled thousands like thunder rolling between mountains, "the inheritance the flood has prepared for us. Here shall we make our stand. Here shall we build our kingdom. Here shall we prove that mortal hands can craft wonders to rival heaven itself." The plain spread before them like an open scroll, waiting for history to be written upon its surface, like a stage prepared for acts of glory or tragedy beyond imagining. Shinar, they named it thus, this land between the rivers, this cradle of their ambitions. Its soil ran so deep and black that a man could thrust his arm elbow deep and still not reach bedrock. Its horizons stretched so far that standing in its center, one could believe himself at the navel of the world, equidistant from all the corners of creation. Rain fell with perfect timing. Sun shone with ideal warmth, and even the beasts of the field seemed gentler here, as though the land itself had been blessed by forces beyond mortal understanding. Cities rose from that rich earth, like flowers blooming in time, measured not by days, but by decades. First came Babel, positioned where the two great rivers ran closest together, controlling all trade and travel through the fertile crescent like a sentinel, guarding the crossroads of the world. Its walls grew higher with each passing season, its gates broader, its towers more numerous, until it dominated the plain like a mountain built by human hands rather than divine decree. Erech followed, its foundations sunk deep in soil that seemed to welcome every stone, every brick, every timber raised upon its surface. Here gathered the craftsmen whose skills would reshape not merely clay and wood, but the very relationship between earth and heaven. Their workshops rang with sounds of innovation, hammer striking anvil, chisel biting stone, kilns breathing fire like dragons tamed to human purpose. Akkad emerged where rivers carved channels perfect for harboring vessels that would carry goods and messages across distances that once divided peoples. Its docks stretched like fingers into water that reflected sky, so purely that merchants swore they could see tomorrow's weather in its depths. Ships arrived bearing treasures from lands whose names were barely whispers on the wind, returning laden with the products of Shinar's incomparable fertility. Kalne rose last, as though the land itself had been saving the best for final flourish. Its builders possessed secrets inherited from the antediluvian world, knowledge preserved through flood and catastrophe in the memories of Noah's sons. Here they experimented with architectural dreams that seemed to defy the very laws governing stone and timber, creating structures that appeared to float above their foundations like visions made solid. Each city bore the mark of Nimrod's vision, the stamp of his refusal to accept the scattered existence heaven had ordained. Streets ran straight as spear shafts, buildings rose in harmonious proportions, and citizens moved with the confident purpose of those who believed themselves inheritors of a destiny greater than their fathers had dared imagine. Languages might be destined to scatter, but not yet, not while unity remained their strength and their glory. Innovation flourished in Shinar's workshops like grain in its fields. Where stone was scarce, human ingenuity supplied alternatives that surpassed the original in both beauty and utility. Clay mixed with straw and baked in furnaces hot as the mouth of volcanoes produced bricks that rang like bronze when struck. Bricks that could bear weights no natural stone could support. Bricks that seemed to laugh at the very concept of limitation. Master builders developed techniques that would remain legends long after their names were forgotten. They learned to calculate stresses and loads with mathematical precision that approached the divine geometry governing star movements. Pulleys and wheels multiplied human strength until single workers could move blocks that would challenge teams of oxen. Measurements became standardized using Nimrod's own royal cubit, ensuring that every structure bore the proportion and harmony he demanded. Architecture became a language of ambition, written in clay and bitumen, each building a word in sentences that declared humanity's refusal to remain earthbound. Towers rose not merely to house families or store grain, but to proclaim the power of minds that dared dream of touching heaven itself. Walls stood not simply to keep out enemies, but to announce to any divine watchers that mortals had learned to build their own security. Workshops hummed with the music of creation, as artisans mastered crafts that bridged the gap between necessity and art. Potters shaped vessels so perfectly formed they seemed grown rather than made. Weavers created tapestries that captured light and held it prisoner in threads that shimmered like captured rainbows. Metalworkers forged tools and weapons whose edges never dulled, whose balance made them extensions of their wielder's will. From Shiner's ziggurat-crowned cities, caravans departed carrying not merely goods, but ideas, not simply products, but the infectious dream of human potential unleashed. Merchants became unconscious evangelists of Nimrod's vision, spreading word of the plain where men built wonders that made ancient achievements seem like children's toys. Tales grew in the telling, descriptions became myths, and myths became magnets drawing the ambitious and the desperate from across the healing world. All roads led to Shinar, it seemed, and all rivers flowed toward Babel. Here was abundance without scarcity, achievement without limitation, unity without the weakness of division. Here was paradise regained, not through divine gift, but through human effort. Heaven brought down to earth through the simple expedient of raising earth toward heaven. Nimrod stood atop his highest tower as evening painted the sky crimson and gold, surveying the kingdom his vision had built and his strength had secured. The plain stretched away in all directions, dotted with cities that gleamed like jewels in the fading light. Smoke from 1,000 hearth fires rose straight into the still air, carrying the prayers and hopes of countless families who had found in Shinar what their scattered existence could never provide: security, prosperity, and the intoxicating sense of being part of something greater than themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that mortal ingenuity could overcome any obstacle heaven might place in their path. Tomorrow would see the beginning of their greatest project yet, the construction that would either crown their achievements or seal their doom. But tonight, Nimrod allowed himself to savor the satisfaction of empire, built from vision and held together by will. Far above, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and among them moved powers that had watched the rise of cities before, that had seen civilizations bloom and wither like flowers in an endless garden. They took note of Shinar's growing glory, measured the ambition burning in human hearts, and began to prepare their own response to mortals who dared dream of storming heaven itself. Black blood seeped from Shinar's wounded earth, like secrets whispered by the depths themselves. Where fissures cracked the plain's surface, dark streams emerged, carrying the scent of creation's hidden foundations. Bitumen that waterproofed the vessels of merchant princes, sealed the jars of precious oils, and most crucially, bound brick to brick with strength that laughed at ordinary mortar. Here was nature's gift to human ambition, the very substance that would transform dreams of divine architecture into monuments of defiance. Workers gathered at dawn around the seeping pools, their hands already stained black from harvesting Earth's treasure. Old men who remembered the flood spoke in hushed tones of similar substances that had sealed Noah's Ark against waters that covered mountains. Now their sons and grandsons would use this same gift to build toward heaven, rather than merely survive heaven's judgment. How fitting that the preservative of salvation should become the foundation of rebellion. Master builders studied the viscous streams with eyes that saw beyond mere utility to possibility itself, mixed with reed fibers and heated until it flowed like honey. Bitumen created bonds stronger than any mason had dreamed possible. Test walls built with this miraculous substance stood firm against rams that shattered stone, remained intact through floods that swept away timber, endured fires that reduced cedar beams to ash and memory. Here, declared Nimrod as he watched workers demonstrate their newfound mastery, is the answer to every limitation our fathers accepted as divine law. Where they saw scarcity, we discover abundance. Where they faced weakness, we forge unbreakable strength. His voice carried across the work sites like prophecy, and indeed, many who heard him began to whisper that their king spoke not merely as mortal ruler, but as oracle of humanity's destined greatness. New ideas leapt forth like summer lightning, each birthing another in a dazzling chain. Under Shinar's soil lay boundless clay, more abundant than the boldest craftsman could imagine. Rivers provided not merely water for mixing, but channels for transporting materials across distances that would have broken the backs of human carriers. Everything necessary for their great work seemed placed by providence, or challenge, within reach of hands bold enough to grasp it. Brick-making became an art refined beyond recognition. Where once men shaped clay into crude blocks dried by sun and chance, now master craftsmen created uniform rectangles with precision that approached divine geometry. Each brick bore not merely the mark of its maker, but inscriptions of power, protective symbols inherited from antediluvian wisdom, names of workers woven into mystical patterns, words of strength whispered over clay while it remained malleable to human will. Kilns multiplied across Shinar's landscape like flowers blooming in orderly rows. Their fires burned day and night, fed by reeds from riverbanks and wood from forests that seemed to replenish themselves faster than axes could fell them. Heat intense enough to melt bronze transformed common earth into building blocks that rang when struck, that gleamed when polished, that seemed to pulse with inner life when touched by hands that knew their secret. A spirit of rivalry stirred, every workshop striving to fashion bricks superior to its neighbors. Some experimented with glazes that made their products shine like jewels in sunlight, creating walls that dazzled observers and reflected sky so purely that birds flew into them, mistaking reflection for reality. Others developed techniques for molding bricks into shapes that interlocked with mechanical precision, requiring no mortar save bitumen's dark embrace to create walls smooth as single stones. Guilds formed around specialties that grew more refined with each passing season. Measurers ensured that every brick conformed to standards derived from Nimrod's royal cubit, creating uniformity across all construction sites. Mixers perfected ratios of clay, straw, and water that produced bricks light enough to lift easily, yet strong enough to bear enormous weights. Inscribers developed systems of marking that identified not merely the maker of each brick, but its intended place in structures whose blueprints existed only in minds touched by architectural genius. Necessity called forth mathematics, as builders mastered the art of balancing pressures their grandfathers would never have grasped. Wheels and pulleys multiplied human strength until single workers moved materials that would have required teams in previous generations. Measurements became so standardized that bricks made in distant workshops fit together seamlessly, as though all of Shinar's craftsmen shared a single mind and purpose. As dreams expanded, so too did the systems of transport built to serve them. Channels carved through Shinar's yielding soil allowed barges to carry millions of bricks from kilns to construction sites without breaking a single one. Roads paved with experimental substances remained smooth, despite traffic that would have turned earthen paths into impassable quagmires. Storage facilities grew into complexes larger than entire cities of previous ages, yet still proved inadequate for the materials required by projects whose scope expanded with each dawn. Old Asher, the clay selector, knelt beside a fresh excavation, his weathered fingers reading secrets in the earth that younger eyes could never perceive. "This will bear the weight of heaven itself," he whispered to his grandson, pressing the boy's palm against soil that felt alive beneath their touch. 3 generations his family had served the great work, and each had contributed discoveries that pushed the boundaries of what mortals deemed possible. Across the workshops, master kilns roared with fires that never died. Keeper Nimra walked between them like a priest tending altars, adjusting airflow with movements so subtle they seemed like dance. His kilns produced bricks that sang when struck, that gleamed like bronze in sunlight, that seemed to pulse with captured flame long after leaving their fiery birth. Kings from distant lands sent emissaries begging to learn his secrets, but Nimra's knowledge died with him, as was the way of true masters. Sacred ceremonies blessed each day's production, as priests of the old ways invoked powers both earthly and celestial. Incense mixed with kiln smoke created clouds that carried prayers skyward, while workers chanted words inherited from the time before the flood. Every brick bore not merely the mark of human hands, but blessings whispered over clay, while it remained malleable to will and wonder. Across Shinar rose storehouses fit for kings, their lofty halls crammed with bricks that shone like small mountains in the glow of fire. Workers climbed these carefully ordered peaks with the reverence of pilgrims approaching shrines, for here lay the components of humanity's greatest dream. Millions upon millions of perfect rectangles waited in patient rows, each one a prayer made solid, a hope transformed into substance that would soon reach toward the throne of heaven itself. Between the storage halls moved caravans that never rested, their wheels worn smooth by journeys between kilns and construction sites that grew more massive with each passing season. Ox-drawn carts groaned beneath loads that would have challenged giants, while skilled drivers navigated paths designed for traffic that dwarfed anything the world had previously witnessed. Still, the accumulation outpaced consumption, brick mountains growing faster than even accelerated construction could diminish them. Nimrod walked among these marvels with satisfaction, burning in his eyes like banked coals. Each perfect brick represented another step toward the summit of human achievement, another proof that mortal hands could accomplish what divine power had previously claimed as its exclusive domain. Soon these materials would take their destined shape, rising toward heaven in defiance of every limitation Earth-dwellers had accepted as unchangeable law. Above them all, whether they knew it or not, celestial watchers observed humanity's fevered preparations with growing alarm. Never since creation's dawn had mortals demonstrated such unity of purpose, such mastery of materials, such dangerous confidence in their own abilities. The time for passive observation was ending. The moment for divine intervention drew near. Beneath stars that wheeled in their ancient patterns, oblivious to the revolution stirring in mortal hearts below, Nimrod climbed the highest Tower of Babel and gazed across his domain with eyes that burned like coals in a smith's forge. The plain of Shinar stretched away in all directions, dotted with cities whose lights twinkled like earthbound constellations, while smoke from countless workshops rose into night air, thick with ambition and the scent of cooling bitumen. For months, the great work had consumed every thought, every conversation, every dream that visited sleep in the hours before dawn. Bricks accumulated in mountains that dwarfed the ziggurats of old, while bitumen flowed in channels carved specifically to serve humanity's most audacious undertaking. Yet something greater than mere construction stirred in the collective soul of Shinar, a hunger that no earthly achievement could satisfy, a thirst that even the sweetest wine could not quench. "We have mastered Earth," Nimrod spoke into the darkness, his words carrying across rooftops where other leaders stood in similar contemplation. "We have tamed rivers, conquered distance, created abundance where our fathers knew only scarcity. Yet still we remain bound to this plane like beasts, our voices lost in the vastness between earth and heaven." His fist clenched around the parapet's stone edge until his knuckles showed white as bone in starlight. Morning brought the great assembly, as all of Shinar's peoples gathered in the vast square that lay at Babel's heart. From every workshop and household they came, master builders with clay-stained hands, merchants whose purses jingled with the wealth of 3 continents, farmers whose fields fed multitudes, and workers whose strength had raised cities from empty plain. Here stood humanity in all its diversity, yet speaking still with one voice, understanding every word that passed between them, as though all shared a single mind. Nimrod stood before them on a platform raised from the same perfect bricks that would soon reach toward heaven itself, his presence commanding attention without need for silence to be called. When he spoke, his voice carried to the furthest edges of the crowd, clear as bronze bells ringing across still water, compelling as thunder that announces the storm's arrival. "People of Shinar, children of those who survived the flood, inheritors of the earth made new," he began, each word carefully chosen to kindle fires already smoldering in hearts grown restless with prosperity. "For generations, we have obeyed the commandment to fill the earth. to scatter like seeds across the vastness of creation. Yet see how much greater we have become by remaining united. See what wonders we have accomplished by joining our strength rather than dividing it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly, like wind through wheat fields, for indeed none could deny the evidence before their eyes. Where other peoples struggled in isolation, scratching bare subsistence from reluctant soil, Shinar bloomed with abundance that seemed almost magical. Where scattered tribes battled over resources and territory, the united cities shared knowledge and wealth in harmony that enriched all. But why should we be content with earthly dominion alone? Nimrod continued, his voice rising with passion that set souls ablaze with possibility. Are we not the children of Noah, who found favor with the Most High? Are we not the inheritors of wisdom that survived the flood, keepers of knowledge that reaches back to Eden itself? Why should heaven remain beyond our reach when earth bends so easily to our will? The crowd pressed closer, drawn by words that spoke to longings they had barely dared acknowledge. Here was someone giving voice to dreams that had haunted their sleep, offering hope that the gulf between mortal and divine might not be unbridgeable after all. Faces upturned toward their king reflected hunger that went deeper than flesh, deeper than any earthly need. Come, Nimrod declared, his arms spread wide as though embracing not merely the multitude before him, but all creation itself. Let us make ourselves a name that will echo through eternity. Let us build a tower whose summit touches the very throne of heaven, whose glory compels even the Most High to acknowledge what mortal hands can accomplish. Let us prove that unity gives us strength to achieve anything imagination can conceive. Roars of approval shook the very foundations of Babel, as thousands of voices joined in acclamation of their king's vision. Here was purpose worthy of their accumulated strength, goal magnificent enough to justify every brick they had made, every innovation they had mastered. Here was immortality offered not as divine gift, but as reward for human achievement, fame that would outlast the stars themselves. Fear had planted this seed in soil prepared by prosperity. The trauma of the flood lived yet in racial memory, stories told by grandfathers who remembered waters covering the highest mountains, darkness that had swallowed entire civilizations without trace. Never again would they be helpless before such judgment. Never again would they depend solely on divine mercy for survival. If another flood threatened, if heaven itself moved against them, they would have their tower, fortress and temple and ladder all in one. Let our tower be more than mere monument to human skill, Nimrod continued, as the crowd hung on every syllable. Let it serve as observatory, where we read divine intentions written in the movements of stars, as fortress that no earthly or celestial power could breach, as temple where we worship not as supplicants, but as equals approaching the throne of creation itself. The vision expanded in minds already drunk on possibility. From the tower's summit, they would command views that encompassed all the earth, would speak with voices that carried to the farthest corners of creation. There they would establish courts that rivaled heaven's own, dispensing justice and wisdom from heights that brought them eye to eye with angels. There they would write their names across the sky itself, ensuring that future generations would remember them not as dust that briefly walked the earth, but as gods who ascended from mortality to claim their rightful place among the immortals. What name shall we make for ourselves? Voices called from the crowd, and Nimrod smiled with satisfaction that blazed like sunrise across his features. We shall be known as the generation that stormed heaven and won, as the people who refused to accept the limitations others deemed unchangeable, as humanity triumphant over every force that sought to keep us bound to earth. Planning began immediately, with urgency, born of vision, finally given voice. The tower would rise in 7 stages, each smaller than the one below, creating steps by which mortals might climb to divine heights. Its base would span distances that took strong men hours to walk around. Its walls would be thick enough to support weight that challenged comprehension. Its summit would pierce clouds and continue climbing until it touched the very floor of heaven. Work gangs, organized with military precision, as every citizen of Shinar, prepared to contribute skills to humanity's greatest endeavor. Architects drew plans that seemed to glow with inner fire. Engineers calculated stresses that had never before been contemplated, while workers sharpened tools and prepared hearts for labor that would transform them from mere men into builders of miracles. Still, far beyond their fevered preparations, in halls where light never faded and music never ceased, other plans were taking shape. Celestial watchers had observed humanity's growing boldness with alarm that deepened into resolve. The time for passive observation was ending, as mortal ambition threatened to upset balances that had governed creation since its first day. Soon divine intervention would descend to meet human hubris, and the plain of Shinar would become stage for confrontation between earth and heaven. Dawn came blood-red over Shinar, as though heaven itself bled at the audacity about to unfold beneath its vault. Across the plain, torches guttered and died as natural light took dominion, revealing a sight that would have staggered the eyes of angels. Hundreds of thousands of workers moving with single purpose toward the site where human ambition would attempt its greatest triumph. The very ground trembled beneath their feet, not with earthquake, but with the drumbeat of history marching toward its most dangerous hour. Nimrod stood where the tower's foundation would be laid, his arms raised towards sky that seemed to press down with the weight of divine displeasure. Around him gathered the priests of the old ways, their hands bearing offerings that would consecrate this ground for purposes that reached beyond mortal understanding. Bulls lowed in their final hour, their blood soon to mark the boundary between what was and what would be, between earth's limitations and heaven's domain. Here we make our stand, the king declared, as dawn wind carried his words across the assembled multitude. Here we plant the seed of immortal fame. Here we begin the ascent that will carry mortal feet to divine heights. Let heaven witness what united humanity can accomplish when we refuse to accept the boundaries others would set upon our greatness. Smoke rose from sacrificial fires as ceremonies began that mixed ancient traditions with innovations born of desperate hope. Incense burned in patterns that copied stellar constellations, while priests chanted words inherited from the time before the flood, words that still carried echoes of the pure tongue spoken in Eden itself. Blood of bulls darkened earth that had known only peaceful purposes, marking this ground forever as the place where humanity chose to challenge the very order of creation. The cornerstone came from quarries that had yielded their finest treasure for this moment, polished smooth as mirror bronze, inscribed with symbols that seemed to move in torchlight, blessed by every priest and sealed with Nimrod's own royal seal. It weighed more than 3 strong men could lift. Yet when the king's hands touched its surface, strength flowed through him like fire through dry reeds, and he placed it in position with ease that whispered of powers beyond the merely human. Organization unfolded with precision that bordered on the miraculous. Work gangs formed in groups of 10, each 10 commanded by an overseer, each 100 by a captain, each 1,000 by a prince whose word carried absolute authority. The unified tongue that had preserved them through prosperity now served purposes darker and more desperate. Instant communication across distances that would have challenged armies. Perfect understanding between minds joined in common cause. 7 terraces would mark the tower's ascent, each stage smaller than the one below, creating steps by which mortals might climb to meet their makers as equals rather than supplicants. The base sprawled across ground that took strong men hours to circle, its circumference encompassing areas larger than entire cities. Walls rose with thickness that could shelter armies. Foundations sank deep enough to anchor mountains. Master builders moved among the workers like generals commanding siege warfare, their voices directing efforts that transformed individual labor into collective miracle. Bricklayers developed rhythms that seemed choreographed by divine hands, each man knowing precisely where his contribution fit in patterns too vast for single minds to comprehend. Ropes sang with tension as pulleys lifted loads that would have required giants, while water carriers moved in streams that brought life to workers whose strength might otherwise have failed under such unprecedented demands. Progress came measured in daily increments that accumulated into weekly triumphs, monthly victories that brought the first terrace closer to completion. Each sunrise revealed growth that astonished even those whose hands had built it. Walls climbing towards sky, with determination that seemed to pull heaven itself down to meet them. Each sunset painted the rising structure in colors that made it appear already touched by celestial fire, already blessed with the glory its builders sought. Competition arose between work gangs, as pride drove men beyond what mere duty could have demanded. Teams vied to place more bricks each day, to achieve greater precision in their measurements, to earn recognition from overseers whose approval meant inclusion in humanity's greatest story. Songs arose from the work sites, wordless melodies that matched the rhythm of hammers and trowels, creating music that transformed labor into worship of human potential. Rope makers crafted cables that could bear weights sufficient to lift temple stones, their fibers twisted and blessed until they possessed strength approaching the mythical. These lines stretched between earth and heaven, like sinews connecting mortal ambition to divine achievement, while the pulleys they served multiplied human muscle until single workers moved burdens that would have challenged legendary heroes. Supply lines stretched across continents as materials flowed toward Babel from every corner of the known world. Caravans arrived bearing timber from forests whose names were whispered like prayers, metals from mountains that scraped heaven's floor, stones whose beauty rivaled captured starlight. Rivers redirected through channels carved specifically for this purpose carried barges laden with treasures that kings would have murdered to possess. Out of pressing need came invention, necessity itself flowering into discovery. Engineers wrestled with weight and equilibrium in ways no earlier generation had ever conceived. Water systems carried fresh supplies to workers laboring at heights where eagles nested, while waste disposal prevented accumulation of refuse that might have poisoned the very air around the construction. Food kitchens fed multitudes with efficiency that rivaled divine provision of manna, ensuring that strength never failed when strength was most desperately needed. Each terrace's completion called for celebration that rivaled royal festivals. Workers gathered in the growing shadow of their achievement, sharing wine and bread while voices rose in songs of triumph that carried across Shinar like prophecies of coming glory. These were not merely builders, but participants in history's most audacious gamble, partners in humanity's boldest bid for equality with powers that ruled from beyond the stars. At night, when torches outlined the tower's ascending spiral against darkness that seemed to press down with increasing weight, observers swore they could see movement in the structure itself. Perhaps it was merely flickering flame, creating illusions of life. Or perhaps the tower had indeed begun to pulse with something beyond mere architecture, with the accumulated will of countless workers whose dreams now took physical form in brick and bitumen. Progress accelerated as techniques refined through practice achieved levels approaching perfection. What had seemed impossible at the project's beginning now appeared routine, while goals that had challenged imagination became stepping stones toward even grander visions. The tower rose not merely toward heaven, but toward apotheosis, toward transformation of humanity from earthbound creatures into beings worthy of divine company. Nimrod climbed the completed portions each evening, his eyes measuring not merely distance traveled, but destiny approached. From these heights, already impressive, though still far from the summit he envisioned, he could see across his entire kingdom, could watch the sun set over lands that acknowledged his dominion. Soon he would stand higher still, would look down upon creation itself from heights that made kings seem like children playing in dust. Overhead, though he remained unaware, powers gathered that had long observed human striving with unease, had seen mortal cooperation conquer the impossible, and now prepared to act before heaven itself was threatened by their soaring pride. The throne room of eternity trembled with the footsteps of the Almighty, as the Most High arose to witness what mortal hands had dared attempt upon the earth below. Angels fell prostrate as light that blazed brighter than 10,000 suns began its descent through spheres of crystal and gold, through realms where time moved like honey and space bent to accommodate celestial will. The very fabric of creation shuddered as its author prepared to look upon the work that threatened to upset balances established since the first dawn. "Let us go down," spoke the voice that had called stars into existence and set boundaries for the sea, each word reverberating through dimensions that mortals could not perceive. The plural echoed strangely in halls where harmony had reigned since creation's birth, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, moving with unity that made human cooperation seem fractured and weak by comparison. Yet their perfect accord now focused on the plane of Shinar, where human unity had achieved something that demanded immediate attention from above. Irony, sharp as the edge of flaming sword, marked the Lord's words as they carried across celestial realms. The Almighty must come down to see what humanity considered sky-reaching, emphasizing the infinite gulf that yawned between mortal ambition and eternal reality. What reached toward the heavens from Earth's perspective barely registered as elevation from the throne room of eternity. Yet the threat was real, not to power that remained absolute, but to purpose that required mortals to remain mortal. Seraphim gathered intelligence with speed that outpaced light itself, their 6 wings carrying them between Earth and the realm above in intervals too brief for measurement. Their reports painted pictures of human achievement that would have been impossible to believe, had not immortal eyes witnessed every brick placed, every terrace completed, every chant of triumph that rose from Shinar's workshops. Humanity had indeed learned to build toward the skies, and their success grew more dangerous with each passing day. "Nothing will be impossible for them," the Lord declared, his words carrying weight that made mountains tremble in their foundations and oceans pause in their eternal rhythm. The statement echoed Eden's crisis when mortals had reached for knowledge that belonged to deity alone. Now they reached for access, for equality, for the right to stand as peers before the throne of creation. Left unchecked, their unified purpose might accomplish what individual pride had never achieved. Gabriel brought word of arrows inscribed with challenges, shot from the tower's growing summit toward the realm above. These crude missiles fell back to Earth long before reaching significant heights, yet their symbolic import burned clear as branded letters. Mortals no longer merely built towards celestial realms. They actively declared war upon the powers that ruled from beyond the stars. Each arrow carried messages of defiance, promises that soon human feet would walk where only angels had trod. Michael reported rituals performed on the tower's highest completed level, ceremonies that claimed ownership of celestial territories not yet reached, but already conquered in human imagination. Priests wearing robes that mimicked the colors of sunset and dawn declared Nimrod's dominion over realms that stretched from earth to sky, while crowds below chanted approval of their king's expanding sovereignty. The very air around these blasphemous rites seemed to thicken with presumption that approached the tangible. Raphael described preparations for installing a throne upon the tower's destined summit, a seat from which Nimrod intended to negotiate with the Most High as equal with equal, king with king. Craftsmen worked precious metals into forms that copied celestial furniture, known only through visions granted to prophets, while scribes prepared documents that would formalize humanity's new status as partners in creation's governance rather than subjects under divine law. They have made themselves like us, observed the Son, his words carrying sorrow deeper than any mortal grief could approach. From his position at the Father's right hand, he saw not merely rebellion, but tragedy. Creatures made in the image of their Creator choosing to grasp rather than receive, to steal rather than be given, to climb rather than be lifted. Their very success in building toward the skies proved their failure to understand the nature of what lay beyond them. The Holy Spirit moved across the face of the deep as he had at creation's beginning, but now his motion carried judgment rather than blessing. Through him came knowledge of human hearts laid bare, the fear that drove their unity, the pride that shaped their ambition, the desperate hunger for security that no earthly achievement could satisfy. They built their tower not from confidence, but from terror, not from strength, but from weakness that masqueraded as power. Celestial council convened with solemnity that had not been witnessed since the pronouncement of humanity's first judgment. Unlike mortal assemblies, where debate raged and factions formed, this deliberation proceeded with perfect harmony, each voice contributing to understanding that encompassed all possibilities, all consequences, all outcomes that might spring from any action taken or withheld. If we allow this to continue, the Father spoke with voice that created worlds and destroyed them with equal ease. They will indeed achieve what they believe impossible, united in language and purpose, driven by fear and ambition. They possess capability to reach heights that were never intended for mortal feet. Their success would not destroy our throne, but it would destroy them, for no creature can bear the weight of godhood without being crushed beneath what it sought to claim. Mercy and justice met in consultation as the court above weighed humanity's fate. To strike them down completely would repeat the flood's devastation, breaking the covenant sealed with rainbow light. Yet to permit their tower's completion would enable destruction more thorough than any external judgment, the annihilation of human nature beneath the weight of false divinity, achieved through rebellion rather than received through grace. Let us confuse their language, came the verdict that would reshape human history more thoroughly than any plague or conquest. Not death, but division, not destruction, but dispersal, judgment wrapped in mercy, correction that preserved even as it punished. They would retain their lives, their families, their basic humanity, but lose the unity that made them dangerous to themselves and presumptuous before their Creator. Angels received their orders with trembling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with awe at wisdom that could turn humanity's greatest strength into their salvation. The very gift that had enabled their rebellion, the pure tongue inherited from Eden, would become the means of their preservation. Scattered by linguistic confusion, They would remain human rather than destroying themselves through successful assault upon what lay beyond mortal reach. Preparation for judgment began with solemnity that matched the world's creation. For indeed, this would be a second making of humanity, a new scattering that would establish patterns lasting until time's end. Languages waited in celestial storehouse like seeds ready for planting, each one destined to carry fragments of the original tongue's power, while limiting its wielders to more modest achievements than storming the realm above. The hour approached when intervention from above would meet human hubris on Shinnar's plain, when unity would shatter into diversity, when the tower that reached toward the heavens would become monument to the mercy that preserved mortals from achieving their own destruction. Earth and sky held their breath as the Most High prepared to answer humanity's challenge with judgment that would echo through every generation yet to come. Morning broke over Shinar with deceptive tranquility, the sun painting the rising tower in shades of gold and crimson that made it appear already touched by celestial fire. Workers stirred to life across the vast construction site, their voices joining in the familiar cadences of dawn prayers and work songs that had unified their labors for months beyond counting. None suspected that this would be the last morning when every word spoken would be understood by every ear that heard it. The judgment fell without warning, swift as lightning, yet thorough as tide. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the gift that had preserved humanity through flood and prosperity shattered like crystal struck by bronze. Words that had flowed like honey from familiar tongues suddenly emerged as meaningless noise, syllables that carried no recognition, sounds that conveyed nothing save the speaker's growing bewilderment and fear. Asher, the master builder, raised his weathered hand toward the supply lines, calling for bronze pins to secure the morning's first course of bricks. His words rang clear in his own ears, carrying the authority of decades spent commanding respect through precise instruction. Yet the workers, who had obeyed his slightest gesture for years, stared at him with blank incomprehension, their faces reflecting the terror of men who had awakened to find themselves strangers in their own land. "Bring the bronze pins," Asher repeated, his voice rising with frustration as familiar syllables met only confused silence. The young men who had served as his hands and eyes, who had anticipated his needs before he voiced them, now looked upon him as though he spoke the language of beasts or demons. Their own attempts at response emerged as gibberish that meant nothing to ears that had understood them perfectly mere moments before. Across the tower's ascending levels, chaos erupted with the suddenness of summer storms. A rope master screaming warnings about a failing line found his cries falling on ears that registered sound but extracted no meaning. Workers who had moved in perfect coordination for months suddenly found themselves unable to comprehend the simplest instructions, their carefully rehearsed choreography dissolving into dangerous confusion as miscommunication led to accident after accident. Pulleys dropped their loads as operators received contradictory signals from supervisors speaking languages that had not existed at dawn. Massive stones meant for the tower's growing crown crashed into scaffolding that collapsed beneath the unexpected impact, sending workers scrambling for safety. They could no longer coordinate through speech. The very air filled with cries in tongues that had never been heard before, each one comprehensible only to those few who shared its sudden birth. Master Zimri watched in horror as his life's work crumbled before his eyes. The mathematical precision that had governed every angle, every measurement, every joint in his magnificent designs required constant communication between architects and builders. Now his detailed instructions emerged as meaningless sound, while the skilled craftsman who had translated his visions into reality responded with words that conveyed nothing save their own mounting desperation. In the mixing pits, where bitumen blended with sacred oils, workers found themselves unable to coordinate the precise timing that kept the black substance from hardening into useless stone. Panic-stricken voices called out warnings, corrections, pleas for understanding, but each speaker heard only alien noise in response. The very foundations of their great work began to suffer as communication broke down at every level of the vast enterprise. Little ones wept for mothers who could not comprehend their cries, while wives watched their husbands in fear as speech they knew became alien and obscure. Families that had shared single thoughts discovered themselves divided by barriers more impenetrable than walls of bronze. Their most intimate conversations transformed into exercises in futile gesture and increasingly frantic mime. Nimrod himself stood upon his highest platform, his commanding voice raised in attempted rallies that fell upon ears deafened by confusion. The words that had once moved multitudes to unified action now reached his subjects as empty wind, while their responses to his increasingly desperate gestures came back as babble that conveyed nothing save their shared bewilderment. For the first time since childhood, the great king found himself powerless to command, reduced to watching his empire dissolve into linguistic chaos. Markets ground to a halt as merchants discovered themselves unable to negotiate prices or explain goods to customers who stared at familiar wares with the incomprehension of foreigners. The complex systems of trade that had bound Shinar's cities together snapped like overstressed ropes, leaving communities isolated by barriers of language where once rivers of commerce had flowed freely between them. Temple priests found their carefully preserved liturgies transformed into meaningless syllables, their ancient words of power rendered impotent by the sudden inability of worshippers to comprehend invocations that had shaped spiritual life since the flood. Congregations scattered in confusion as sacred ceremonies collapsed into cacophony, each participant hearing only babble where once harmonious voices had risen in unified praise. Out of chaos, faint patterns stirred, appearing as islands breaking the surface of primal waters. Families discovered that parents and children, husbands and wives, often shared the same strange new tongue that had replaced their familiar speech. Workers who had labored side by side found themselves bound by common understanding, while separated from colleagues who had become linguistic strangers overnight. The tower construction ground to a complete halt as the impossibility of coordinated effort became undeniably clear. Signals that had once conveyed complex engineering instructions now met with blank stares or dangerous misinterpretation. The dream of reaching toward the realm above died not in catastrophic collapse, but in the slower agony of communication severed, of unity shattered into fragments too small to accomplish what their sum had made possible. Men and women drifted into clusters, united by shared words, each group speaking a tongue that seemed allotted by unseen hands. What had been one people speaking one language suddenly became dozens of distinct communities, each comprehensible within its own boundaries but alien to all others. Fear drove the newly separated tribes toward desperate solutions, as food supplies organized around universal communication suddenly became accessible only to those who could negotiate in the right tongue. Violence erupted between groups that had been neighbors at dawn, but had become foreigners by noon. Their inability to explain intentions or negotiate differences, leading to conflicts that blood alone seemed capable of resolving. The great name they had sought to make for themselves twisted into mockery as Babel, once meaning gate of God, became the word that described confusion, the sound of human ambition dissolving into meaningless noise. Their monument to unity stood half-finished against the sky, a testament not to what mortal cooperation could achieve, but to how quickly such achievements could crumble when the foundation that supported them was swept away. As sunset painted the wounded plain in shades of blood and gold, the people of Shinar faced a choice that would reshape the world. They could remain in proximity to one another, struggling to rebuild some form of cooperation despite the barriers of language, or they could accept the scattering that their new diversity seemed to demand. The unified vision that had driven their great work lay shattered like pottery dropped on stone, its fragments scattered too widely to be gathered again. Nimrod stood alone on his unfinished tower as darkness fell, the king of a realm that no longer existed, ruler of subjects who could no longer understand his commands. Around him stretched a city where every street had become foreign territory, where every conversation had become an exercise in futility, where the dream of human unity had died in the space of a single morning that would be remembered until the end of time. Dawn came grey over Babel, the sun struggling through smoke from 100 abandoned fires as the great dispersal began. What had been humanity's greatest city the day before now resembled a vast camp of strangers. Each group huddled around the precious gift of shared speech while eyeing their former neighbors, with the wariness of people who no longer recognized friend from foe. The tower stood like a broken tooth against the morning sky, its unfinished summit a monument to ambitions that had died in the space between heartbeats. Families faced choices that would have been unthinkable when the sun last set on a unified world. Children who had babbled their first words in the pure tongue now spoke languages their grandparents could not comprehend, while parents found themselves unable to sing the lullabies that had soothed their infants to sleep. Husbands and wives who had shared thoughts as well as beds discovered barriers between them more impenetrable than bronze walls, their most intimate conversations reduced to gestures and desperate pantomime. Old Methuselah, the caravan leader, stood before his assembled drivers, men who had followed him across continents and through dangers that would have destroyed lesser bands. Now half his trusted companions stared at him with the blank incomprehension of foreigners, while the other half spoke in tongues he had never heard. The great trading networks that had bound distant lands together through commerce and kinship lay shattered, their delicate web of relationships severed by linguistic barriers that made negotiation impossible. By the third day, movement began, as naturally as water seeking its level, those who shared the new gift of common speech gravitating toward each other, with the desperate hunger of survivors clinging to wreckage from a shipwreck. Families dissolved and reformed around the accidents of divine apportionment, children following voices they could understand rather than blood they could no longer communicate with, parents abandoning offspring whose words had become alien sounds. The Javethites gathered in the northern sections of the city, their new tongue flowing with consonants sharp as mountain wind and vowels that seemed to echo with the call of distant places. Something in their altered speech drew their eyes toward horizons they had never considered, toward lands where ice shaped the seasons and forests stretched beyond sight. Their leader, a young architect named Gomer, found himself speaking of territories that existed only in dreams, of kingdoms waiting to be claimed by those bold enough to venture into the unknown. Southward, the sons of Ham clustered around tongues that carried the heat of desert sands and the rhythm of great rivers flowing toward unknown seas. Cush the Strong, who had served as Nimrod's lieutenant, discovered that his new language came with visions of lands where the sun ruled unchallenged, where gold gleamed in riverbeds and spices grew wild on mountain slopes. His people listened with growing excitement to words that painted pictures of paradise regained through exploration rather than construction. Between them, speaking a tongue that seemed to carry echoes of the original language lost to confusion, the Semites gathered around aged Shem himself. Though his hair had grown white in the service of the great work, his new words came with authority that suggested preservation rather than innovation, continuity rather than adventure. When he spoke of journeys, it was not toward unknown lands, but back to older wisdom, toward promises made by the Most High to fathers whose names were already becoming legend. Each group developed its own response to the disaster that had befallen them. The northbound tribes threw themselves into preparation for journeys that would carry them beyond the edges of known maps, their voices rising in songs that spoke of conquest and discovery. The southern clans organized expeditions toward lands where rivers birthed civilizations and mountains held treasures beyond imagining. The central peoples, led by those who remembered most clearly the old ways, began gathering the remnants of antediluvian knowledge that might yet be preserved despite linguistic chaos. What once carried caravans of commerce now bore streams of exiles as the great scattering accelerated. Paths that had once carried goods between markets now bore entire peoples toward destinies they could only imagine. The roads leading north filled with wagons bearing families whose new tongue carried them toward territories where winter ruled for half the year, where survival would depend on skills their ancestors had never needed to develop. Eastward flowed those whose language seemed to bubble with the music of countless rivers, their words painting pictures of valleys where rice would grow and tea would flourish, of mountains that scraped the sky and oceans that stretched beyond imagination. Their departure songs spoke of patience and persistence, of achievements that would be measured not in decades but centuries, of wisdom that would accumulate like sediment in river deltas. Westward moved tribes whose tongues carried the crash of waves and the call of seabirds, their new words filling them with dreams of islands scattered like jewels across endless waters, of continents waiting beyond horizons that had never known human footprints. Their preparations included skills that would have seemed useless in Shinar's landlocked cities: the building of boats, the reading of stars, the preservation of food for journeys that might last months beyond sight of shore. Beyond geography, the scattering became an alchemy of words that refashioned the mind. Each new tongue brought with it different ways of seeing, distinct methods of understanding reality that would shape entire cultures. Those who spoke in terms of time flowing like water developed philosophies different from those whose words measured existence in cycles of seasons. Languages that distinguished dozens of types of snow produced peoples whose relationship with winter differed fundamentally from those whose tongues barely acknowledged cold. The tower itself became a crossroads where departing groups left messages for those who might come after. Symbols carved in stone, patterns woven into textiles, songs adapted to new tongues yet carrying memories of unity that had once bound all humanity together. These fragments would travel with the scattered peoples, like seeds carrying the genetic memory of their parent plant, ensuring that something of the original dream would survive even in its failure. As seasons turned and the great migration continued, the plain of Shinar emptied like a pool with broken walls. Where once millions had labored in unified purpose, now only scattered remnants remained, those too old to travel, too attached to abandon their life's work, or too afraid to venture into unknown territories. The great cities that had risen from virgin soil in mere decades began their slow return to earth, their walls already showing the effects of neglect, their markets silent except for the whisper of wind through empty stalls. The story that had begun with one people speaking one tongue now continued as 70 nations carrying fragments of that original unity toward every corner of the earth. Each would develop its own customs, its own understanding of the forces that governed existence, its own relationship with the powers that ruled from beyond the stars. Yet all would carry within their collective memory the echo of that morning, when human speech had shattered like glass, when unity had become diversity, when the dream of storming the realm above had died in the confusion of tongues that could no longer comprehend each other. In years to come, the scattered children of Babel would tell the story differently, each in their own language, each through the lens of their own experience. But all would remember the tower, all would speak of the time when humanity had been one, and all would wonder whether such unity might someday be restored, or whether its very possibility had died forever on the plain, where human ambition had reached too high and paid the price of its presumption. Centuries passed like seasons over the plain of Shinar, yet the abandoned tower remained, its broken summit thrust against the sky like an accusation written in brick and bitumen. Wind carved channels through its unfinished walls, while rain pooled in chambers that had never known their intended purpose. Yet still the massive structure endured. Birds nested in its highest reaches, and wild beasts made dens in its foundations. But no human hand dared add so much as a single brick to what the Most High had left incomplete. Babylon rose around those ancient ruins like new growth from the root of a lightning-struck tree, its builders drawn by the fertility of soil, enriched by the ashes of older ambitions. King Hammurabi walked among the scattered stones of Babel's outer courts, his eyes measuring what remained with the calculating gaze of one who understood the power that slept in consecrated ground. Here his own city would establish its heart, feeding on the dreams that had died in confusion, yet somehow survived in the very earth beneath his feet. What men began, men may yet complete, declared Hammurabi to his architects as they studied the tower's mathematical proportions. His workers approached the ancient structure with reverence mixed with fear, knowing that they walked where humanity's greatest ambition had met its greatest humiliation. Yet every attempt to incorporate the original stones into new construction met with mysterious failure, tools that shattered without cause, mortar that cracked overnight, measurements that shifted like mirages in desert heat. Nebuchadnezzar the Great stood centuries later, where Hammurabi had planned, his empire stretching from the rising of the sun to its setting, his treasury filled with tribute from nations whose very names had been unknown in Babel's day. "We shall rebuild what the ancients began," the king declared, his voice echoing across courtyards where his new ziggurat rose in conscious imitation of humanity's first attempt to reach the celestial realm. Aritemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, shall complete the work that confusion interrupted. Master masons whispered of stones that bled when struck, of foundations that seemed to shift in the night, of inscriptions in the original bricks that changed meaning depending on who read them and when. Some claimed these marks spoke of construction techniques that surpassed mortal understanding, mathematical principles that human minds could glimpse but never fully comprehend, architectural visions that required the cooperation of gods and mortals working in perfect harmony. Assyrian conquerors swept across Mesopotamia's fertile plains like wolves from the north, their war chariots raising dust clouds that darkened the sun. Sargon the Great stood among Babel's ruins, his scribes recording discoveries that defied explanation. Ancient bricks bore inscriptions in scripts that predated the confusion of tongues, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, writing that conveyed meaning without conforming to any known system of language. These marks speak of power that transcends mortal understanding, reported the royal scribe as they examined stones that glowed with inner light in darkness, yet appeared ordinary in daylight. Some of these Inscribed bricks Sargon ordered destroyed, casting them into furnaces hot enough to melt bronze, yet finding that flames could not erase symbols carved by hands guided by knowledge that had survived the flood itself. Persian armies crossed the rivers under Cyrus the Great, their Zoroastrian priests performing rituals meant to ward off influences that lingered around the tower, like smoke from sacrificial fires never properly extinguished. Here light and darkness met in combat that shook creation's foundations, spoke their wise men as they walked among ruins that had witnessed the first great confrontation between human ambition and celestial authority. These mortals sought to escape eternal conflict by building beyond both kingdoms, yet learned that no earthly structure could reach such transcendent realms. Greek merchants arrived with Alexander's conquests, their practical minds seeking to understand achievements that dwarfed their own engineering marvels. Observers noted that completing such a structure would require more bricks than existed in all the cities of their known world, more bronze than had been mined from the earth since men first learned to work metal, more human effort than had been expended on all other construction projects in living memory. Roman engineers probed the tower's foundations with characteristic thoroughness, their logical minds confronting construction techniques that challenged everything they thought they understood about building. Test excavations revealed foundation stones larger than temple columns, laid with precision that exceeded anything Roman engineering had achieved despite centuries of accumulated knowledge. Joints remained so tight that knife blades could not penetrate between stones, while mortar had hardened beyond anything contemporary builders could duplicate. They possessed secrets we have forgotten, admitted the chief engineer, as he studied walls that had resisted both time and human attempts at modification. Whether this knowledge came from divine inspiration or from human genius elevated beyond normal limits, none could determine. Fire that reduced forests to ash barely scorched the tower's glazed surfaces, while earthquakes that toppled mountains left its walls barely cracked. The ziggurat form became Babel's most enduring legacy, copied in diminished scale by every civilization that rose in Mesopotamia's fertile valleys. Each new empire built its own tower, reaching toward the skies, each one a conscious echo of humanity's first attempt to bridge the gap between Earth and the realm above. Yet none achieved the original's scale or dared repeat its explicit challenge to celestial authority. Local legends grew around the ruins like vines around broken walls, stories preserving memories of the time when all humanity spoke with one voice. Children playing among fallen stones claimed to hear whispers in tongues that had died with the confusion, while shepherds reported seeing lights moving through empty chambers when stars aligned in patterns that recalled older constellations. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands, their various tongues creating a Babel of their own, as they attempted to communicate their reverence for this monument to human ambition and limitation. Merchants sold fragments of the original bricks as talismans, though whether these relics brought blessing or curse remained a matter of heated debate among philosophers and priests. Thus, the tower that had begun as humanity's greatest achievement became its most persistent mystery, a question written in architecture that no civilization succeeded in answering. Every empire that rose in its shadow carried forward the dream of completion, while bearing witness to the reality of its impossibility, each generation discovering anew that some boundaries cannot be crossed by mortal effort, no matter how unified, how skilled, how determined that effort might be. From Ur of the Chaldees, where ziggurats cast their shadows across streets that still whispered of Babel's fallen glory, God called forth a man whose story would reshape humanity's understanding of unity and scattering, pride and humility. Abram, later to be named Abraham, walked among ruins that older generations had tried to complete, breathed air still thick with the memory of confusion, and heard in the divine voice that summoned him an echo of the same power that had once shattered human speech into 70 fragments. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household," commanded the voice that had once descended to see the tower, "and go to the land I will show you." The irony burned like bronze in a smith's forge, where Nimrod had sought to make a name for himself by building toward the realm above. The Lord would make Abraham's name great by calling him away from all that men typically use to establish identity and reputation. The promise that followed carried weight that only those who remembered Babel's failure could fully appreciate. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Where the tower builders had sought blessing by grasping, Abraham would receive it by letting go. Where they had tried to gather all nations under one roof reaching toward the sky, his descendants would carry blessing to all the scattered nations of the earth. Hebrew scribes who preserved these accounts centuries later understood the profound connection between Babel's scattering and Abraham's calling. The same God who had divided human speech had chosen one man to become the father of a people who would remember both events as foundational to their understanding of divine purpose. Their chronicles wove the stories together with threads of gold and scarlet, showing how judgment and mercy flowed from the same inexhaustible source. The tower builders sought to make themselves a name, wrote the ancient chroniclers in their sacred scrolls, their reed pens scratching across papyrus that would outlast the bronze tablets of kings. Yet their names are forgotten while dust covers their achievement. The Lord scattered them in mercy, for had they succeeded in their rebellion, destruction would have consumed them more thoroughly than any flood. Better to live scattered and humble than to perish unified in pride. Theological implications flowed from this understanding, like water from a struck rock. Human unity without divine guidance led inevitably to destructive pride. This lesson the Hebrew teachers embedded in every retelling of Babel's story. The confusion of tongues served not as arbitrary punishment, but as necessary intervention, preventing humanity from achieving a success that would have destroyed them more completely than any external judgment. During the long years of Babylonian exile, when Jerusalem's children sat by foreign rivers and wept for Zion's songs, the story of Babel took on new meaning, sharp as bronze swords. Jewish scribes laboring under the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's reconstructed ziggurat saw their captor's arrogance reflected in the ancient tower builder's presumption. The very city that held them prisoner stood as monument to the recurring human delusion that mortal hands could craft security apart from the Almighty's blessing. "See how they repeat the ancient folly," murmured Daniel as he gazed upon Babylon's hanging gardens from his palace window, watching workmen add new courses to ziggurats that competed with clouds. They build toward the sky and call it worship, yet their hearts remain bound to earth. They have learned nothing from the confusion that scattered their fathers, nothing from the judgment that broke humanity's first attempt to storm the realms above. Ezekiel the priest, transported in visions to heights that no tower could reach, saw the connection between Babel's hubris and Babylon's contemporary pride with clarity that burned like fire in his bones. His prophecies against the nations echoed with themes first sounded when divine judgment fell upon Shinar's plain, warnings that power built on presumption would crumble like bricks returned to clay. "Babylon will fall," he declared to fellow exiles, who could barely imagine such a reversal of fortune. Just as surely as the original tower fell to confusion, the mighty will be brought low, the proud scattered, the arrogant reduced to babbling like children who have forgotten their own names. For the Lord who divided tongues can divide kingdoms, and he who scattered nations can scatter armies like chaff before the wind. Isaiah took up the theme, with voice that rang like silver bells across valleys of prophetic vision. His words against Babylon's king carried echoes of the judgment that had once fallen upon Nimrod. How you have fallen from the sky, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the skies. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. The parallels blazed clear as midday sun to those who had eyes to see. Just as the tower builders had sought to ascend to divine heights through architecture, Babylon's rulers sought to achieve the same elevation through conquest. Both efforts would meet the same fate: confusion, scattering, and the humbling recognition that no mortal power could successfully challenge the sovereignty of the Most High. Jeremiah's prophecies carried the theme forward with relentless precision. Babylon will become a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives. The city that had risen around Babel's ruins would itself become ruins, its ziggurat-crowned towers falling to the same power that had once confused human speech and scattered human ambition across the face of the earth. For the Hebrews, the tower's meaning blended caution with an undercurrent of hope. If the Lord had scattered humanity in judgment, might not the same power gather them in mercy? If confusion had come as punishment for pride, might not clarity return as reward for humility? The prophets spoke of a coming day when the scattered children of Abraham would be regathered from all the nations where divine judgment had dispersed them. In that day, Isaiah proclaimed with voice that carried across centuries yet unborn, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people. From Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. The great regathering would reverse Babel's scattering, bringing unity not through human effort, but through divine grace. Across the synagogues of the diaspora, learned voices argued over the mysteries folded into the ancient tale. Rabbi Akiba taught that Babel revealed the difference between human wisdom and divine wisdom, mortal cleverness that sought to eliminate mystery by building toward it, contrasted with the Lord's wisdom that preserved mystery by maintaining the distance between creator and creation. His students carried these insights to communities scattered from Alexandria to Babylon itself. In the schools of learning that flourished wherever Hebrew was spoken, children learned to read the story as both warning and promise. The confusion of tongues demonstrated that the Most High would not permit his creatures to destroy themselves through successful rebellion, while the survival of Noah's descendants proved that divine mercy endured even when judgment fell. Each generation discovered in Babel's ruins a mirror reflecting their own struggles with pride and their own need for the humility that came only through recognition of the Most High's sovereignty over all the affairs of men. Sargon II of Assyria stood before Babel's weathered stones, with eyes that had witnessed the fall of kingdoms and the submission of nations that once thought themselves beyond mortal reach. His empire stretched from the mountains of Armenia to the marshes where the great rivers met the sea. Yet even he approached these ancient ruins with the careful reverence of one who understood that some achievements transcended the rise and fall of mere dynasties. Here we shall succeed where the ancients failed, he declared to his assembled engineers and priests, his voice carrying across courtyards where his own ziggurats rose in conscious competition with the original tower. We have reunited what the gods scattered: Babylonian and Assyrian, Phoenician and Hebrew, all now bow beneath our standards. If unity of purpose could raise these stones toward the sky, how much more shall we achieve with unity of rule? For all his boasting, Sargon ordered his builders to work around rather than upon the original foundation. Stories filtered through his court of workmen who had attempted to quarry stones from Babel's base, only to find their tools shattered and their hands withered. Better to let the ancient structure stand as monument to mortal ambition, while raising new towers that might avoid whatever curse still lingered in those consecrated bricks. Nebuchadnezzar's scribes rewrote history with reed pens dipped in royal ambition, their cuneiform tablets transforming Babel's story from divine judgment into celestial approval. According to their revised accounts, Marduk himself had commissioned the tower's construction, blessing human efforts to create a bridge between earthly and divine realms. The confusion of tongues became not punishment, but gift, the gods' way of ensuring that different peoples would develop distinct skills that could be united under Babylonian rule. The ancient texts lie, proclaimed the court scholars, as they carved their alternative version into tablets that would deceive future generations. The tower fell not through divine wrath, but through human failing. Where the original builders lacked the wisdom to complete their work, we possess knowledge that will ensure success. Our Etemenanki shall achieve what theirs could not, a meeting place where gods and mortals commune as equals. Persian conquest brought new interpretations as Zoroastrian priests walked among the ruins with eyes trained to see cosmic conflict written in stone and mortar. Ahura Mazda and Ahriman had battled here, they claimed, with humanity caught between forces of light and darkness. The tower represented mortals' attempt to escape this eternal struggle by building beyond both influences, reaching toward a realm where such conflicts might be transcended. They failed because they sought to flee rather than choose, taught Zarathustra's disciples as they performed purification rituals around the base of structures that had witnessed the first great confrontation between human ambition and divine authority. Light and darkness must be acknowledged and the proper side chosen. No earthly structure can lift mortals above the battle that defines existence itself. Greek philosophers approached the ruins with minds shaped by geometry and logic, seeking rational explanations for achievements that challenged their understanding of engineering principles. Herodotus measured the foundations with instruments that had mapped pyramids and calculated the Earth's circumference, recording dimensions that seemed to shift depending upon the time of day and season of measurement. The mathematics required to complete such construction, he wrote in scrolls that would be studied in libraries yet to be built, exceed human capability to calculate, not merely the quantity of materials, though that alone would bankrupt empires, but the precision needed to maintain structural integrity at such heights demands knowledge that surpasses mortal understanding. Aristotle's students debated whether the tower represented humanity's greatest achievement or its most dangerous folly. Some argued that the attempt to reach divine realms through architecture demonstrated the noble aspiration that separated humans from beasts. Others contended that such presumption revealed the very pride that made mortals unfit for divine company, proving that wisdom lay in accepting rather than transcending natural limitations. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation, epic, absorbed Babel's memory into its cosmic narrative. Marduk's victory over Tiamat became the template for understanding all conflicts between order and chaos, with the tower representing humanity's role as builders of civilization in an universe threatened by primordial forces. The confusion of tongues transformed into necessary diversification, ensuring that no single culture could dominate the complex balance required for cosmic stability. Egyptian scribes recorded their own version of the story, connecting it to their pyramid-building traditions and their understanding of the pharaoh's divine nature. The tower became humanity's failed attempt to achieve what only god-kings could accomplish: the bridging of mortal and divine realms through properly consecrated architecture guided by celestial wisdom rather than earthly ambition. Indian traders brought tales from the Indus Valley of similar towers that reached toward Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain that supported the heavens. Chinese merchants spoke of ladders built to carry mortals to the realm of the Jade Emperor. Each culture recognized in Babel's story an echo of their own myths about the separation between earth and sky, the gulf that divided mortal from divine. As the first millennium drew toward its close, Babel had become less historical event than universal symbol. Every nation that achieved greatness seemed to recapitulate the pattern: unity leading to ambition, ambition to overreach, overreach to divine intervention that scattered what had been gathered. The tower served as warning to some, challenge to others, but to all, it represented the fundamental question that each civilization must answer. What happens when mortal achievement reaches toward realms that may not welcome earthly visitors? Rome's engineers studied the ruins with characteristic thoroughness, their practical minds seeking techniques that might strengthen their own monumental construction projects. Yet even they found mysteries that Roman logic could not penetrate, forces that Roman discipline could not master, reminders that some achievements lay beyond the reach of mortal ambition, no matter how systematically organized or ruthlessly pursued. Alexander the Great stood before Babylon's ziggurat at sunset, his young face bronzed by victories that had carried him from Macedonia's mountains to India's rivers, his eyes reflecting ambitions that burned brighter than the torches illuminating ancient stones. The ruins of the original tower loomed beyond the newer construction, like a challenge written in weathered brick, their broken summit seeming to mock every earthly achievement, no matter how magnificent. Here, he declared to his generals, as evening shadows lengthened across courtyards that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, I shall complete what Nimrod began. Where the ancient king failed through lack of vision, I shall succeed through understanding that comes from having conquered the known world. If mortals united under single purpose built toward the sky, how much greater shall be the achievement of mortals united under single rule. Work began immediately with characteristic Macedonian efficiency. Engineers who had bridged rivers and leveled mountains applied their skills to clearing rubble from the tower's base, while architects studied the surviving courses to understand the mathematical principles that had enabled such massive construction. Yet from the first day, the project seemed cursed by influences that defied rational explanation. When the first blows landed on the old blocks, the tools broke apart, their bronze blades chipping as though the rock were harder than granite. Workers reported that the ancient bricks grew hot to the touch, despite being shaded from the sun, while measurements taken at dawn showed different dimensions when checked at noon. Foundations that had supported incredible weight for centuries began to crack when new construction attempted to build upon them. Alexander himself fell ill within a month of beginning the work, his body burning with fevers that no physician could explain or cure. Macedonian doctors blamed the climate. Persian healers pointed to malign influences, but Babylonian priests whispered that the tower itself rejected attempts at completion. The king, who had never known defeat in battle, found himself conquered by an enemy he could not see, let alone fight. Death came to Alexander in the shadow of the very tower he had sought to complete. his final words reportedly asking whether any mortal could succeed where he had failed. His body lay in state beneath walls that had witnessed his ambition's birth and death, while his generals gathered to divide an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Indus. The broken summit remained unchanged, a monument to the limits that even world conquerors could not transcend. Hellenistic scholars who followed in Alexander's wake approached Babel with minds trained in philosophy rather than conquest. Philo of Alexandria, versed in both Greek learning and Hebrew wisdom, interpreted the confusion of tongues through the lens of Platonic thought. The divine logos had fragmented human logos, he taught, creating necessary multiplicity that allowed truth to be approached from many directions rather than seized through single perspective. Unity without diversity becomes tyranny, Philo wrote in treatises that would influence generations of thinkers, while diversity without unity becomes chaos. The scattering of tongues prevented the first error while making the second inevitable. Only through divine wisdom can the proper balance be restored, diversity that serves unity rather than destroying it, unity that celebrates diversity rather than crushing it. The Septuagint translation, produced in Alexandria's great library, subtly shifted the tower's meaning through choices of Greek vocabulary. Where Hebrew texts emphasized reaching toward divine realms, the Greek version stressed the making of a name, transforming vertical ambition into horizontal reputation seeking. The ancient construction became less about ascending to godhood and more about achieving fame that would outlast mortal life. Greek dramatists discovered in Babel rich material for tragedies about hubris and its inevitable consequences. Aeschylus wrote lost plays, comparing the tower builders to Prometheus stealing fire, both stories illustrating the price mortals paid for attempting to claim what belonged to immortals alone. Sophocles explored themes of communication and isolation, showing how language barriers separated people more effectively than any physical walls. The Stoics found in Babel's story confirmation of their teaching about accepting fate rather than fighting cosmic order. Marcus Aurelius meditated on the ziggurat as symbol of the futility that awaited all attempts to impose human will upon divine plan. Better to work within natural limitations than to exhaust oneself battling boundaries that would ultimately prove unbreachable. Epicureans drew different lessons, arguing that the construction demonstrated why mortals should focus on achievable pleasures rather than impossible dreams. The builder's error lay not in challenging the gods, but in pursuing a goal that could never bring satisfaction, even if achieved. Better to find contentment in friendship and simple joys than to waste life on grandiose projects doomed to failure. Cynics, like Diogenes, used Babel as example of civilization's corruption, pointing to the edifice as ultimate symbol of humanity's departure from natural simplicity. They built toward the sky while forgetting how to live on earth. He taught to audiences gathered in Athens' Agora. Language barriers mattered less than the barrier they erected between themselves and wisdom that comes only through accepting rather than transcending human nature. Neoplatonic philosophers developed elaborate theories, connecting Babel to their understanding of emanation and return. The ancient structure represented soul's attempt to return to the One through material means rather than spiritual purification. The confusion of tongues demonstrated that divine ascent required inner transformation, not external construction. In secret rites, initiates reenacted the tale of the shattered tower, seeking through ritual to reclaim the language once spoken in unison before its fall. Initiates learned sacred words, supposedly preserved from before the confusion, syllables that could bridge the gaps between scattered peoples and perhaps even between mortal and divine realms. As Hellenistic culture spread throughout Alexander's former empire, Babel became a common reference point for discussing the relationship between human ambition and divine authority. Artists depicted the monument in mosaics and frescoes that adorned villas from Spain to Afghanistan, while poets composed verses comparing their own rulers to Nimrod, sometimes as praise, sometimes as warning. The broken ziggurat's image appeared on coins minted by dynasties that claimed descent from Alexander, serving as symbol of both aspiration and caution. Some rulers used it to proclaim their intention of completing what the ancient king had begun, while others employed it as reminder of the limits that even the greatest mortals must respect. In Jerusalem's upper room, where wind from an unknown source filled the gathered disciples with power that transformed fishermen into fearless heralds, the scattered tongues of Babel found their answer. Fire descended not as judgment, but as gift, not to confuse, but to clarify, enabling Galileans to speak in languages they had never learned to audiences they had never met. The miracle reversed in a single morning what celestial justice had accomplished across centuries of separation. See how the Spirit restores what mortal pride destroyed, declared Peter to the crowd that gathered in amazement, his words somehow comprehensible to Parthians and Medes, Mesopotamians and Judeans, visitors from Rome and sojourners from Egypt. Where the ancient city scattered humanity through confusion, Christ gathers the nations through understanding. What was lost in pride is restored through humility. Early Christian teachers recognized in Pentecost the heavenly response to Babel's ancient challenge. Where the tower builders had sought to unite people through architectural ambition, the apostles achieved true unity through spiritual submission. Where Nimrod's followers had grasped for equality with divine powers, Christ's disciples received authority through surrender to the Almighty's will. Justin Martyr, writing in Rome while emperors still fed Christians to lions, drew parallels that would influence theological thinking for generations. The confusion of tongues served as mercy disguised as punishment. He taught to students who met in hidden chambers beneath the imperial city. Had mortals succeeded in reaching celestial realms through rebellion, they would have faced destruction more complete than any flood. The Lord scattered them to preserve them, dividing their strength to protect them from the consequences of their own success. Clement of Alexandria, surrounded by scrolls that contained the wisdom of ages, developed elaborate interpretations that connected the ancient structure to the Christian understanding of human nature. The tower represented fallen mankind's attempt to achieve through works what could only be received through grace. The confusion of languages demonstrated that external unity without internal transformation inevitably collapsed into chaos and division. They built with bricks rather than living stones, Clement wrote in treatises that would be copied and studied across the expanding Christian world. Their mortar was bitumen drawn from earth's depths, not love poured from the Sacred Heart. Such construction, however impressive in scale, cannot reach the realm where only spirits purified by faith may ascend. Origen, whose mind encompassed both Hebrew scriptures and Greek philosophy, found in Shinar's monument a perfect illustration of the difference between earthly and spiritual achievement. The builders possessed every advantage that material civilization could provide: unity of purpose, abundance of resources, mastery of construction techniques, yet failed because they lacked the one thing necessary for true ascent: recognition of their dependence upon divine grace. Augustine, walking the African shores where Carthage once stood, meditated on the ancient edifice as the ultimate expression of the city of man opposing the city of God. The structure represented people's recurring delusion of self-sufficiency, the prideful belief that mortal hands could craft security and significance apart from their creator's blessing. Its fall prefigured every earthly empire's inevitable collapse when built upon foundations of pride rather than grace. See how they said, "Come, let us make bricks," Augustine observed in sermons that would echo through centuries of Christian teaching. They made what God had provided naturally, transforming clay into artificial stone, seeking to improve upon creation through their own cleverness. This substitution of mortal manufacture for heavenly gift runs through all their endeavor. Bricks for stone, bitumen for mortar, their name for God's glory. Augustine of Hippo developed this theme with characteristic brilliance, showing how each element of the construction revealed mankind's preference for artificial achievement over natural blessing. The builders rejected the stones that lay ready for their use, insisting on making bricks that required elaborate preparation. They scorned simple mortar that could be mixed from available materials, choosing instead bitumen that bubbled up from Earth's corrupt depths. Their very unity became division, Augustine continued, his words reaching audiences that stretched from British shores to Persian borders. United in pride, they created the conditions for scattering. Speaking one language in rebellion, they earned the confusion that made communication impossible. Seeking to make themselves a name, they achieved only the Babel that means meaningless noise. John Chrysostom, golden-mouthed preacher of Constantinople, used the ancient story as a recurring theme in homilies that filled the greatest church in Christendom. He emphasized the monument as symbol of collective sin, showing how entire civilizations could unite in error, requiring celestial intervention not as cruelty, but as mercy that prevented greater catastrophe. Had they succeeded in their rebellion, Chrysostom proclaimed to congregations that included emperors and beggars, they would have faced the same fate as Satan himself, successful rebellion that becomes eternal damnation. The confusion of tongues saved them from achieving a victory that would have destroyed them utterly. Better to be scattered in humility than gathered in successful pride. Latin Christianity developed elaborate allegorical interpretations that saw in Shinar's 7 levels representations of the 7 deadly sins, with pride at the summit preventing the tower's completion. The confusion of tongues prefigured the need for Christ as universal translator, the Word made flesh who could bridge every gap created by mortal folly and sacred judgment. Jerome, laboring in his Bethlehem cave to translate scriptures into Latin that would serve the Western Church for centuries, found in the ancient narrative confirmation of his conviction that sacred truth required careful transmission rather than presumptuous innovation. The builders had possessed the pure language inherited from Eden, yet used it for rebellion rather than worship, losing through misuse what they might have preserved through reverent stewardship. Eastern Christianity approached the story through different theological lenses, emphasizing theosis, people's calling to participation in the Almighty's nature through grace rather than grasping. The structure represented the false path of seeking godhood through external achievement rather than internal transformation. The confusion of tongues demonstrated that true ascent required spiritual purification, not architectural ambition. Basil the Great, writing from Cappadocia's cave churches, taught that the old story revealed the futility of attempting to approach God through material means. They built toward the skies with earthbound materials. He explained to monks who had chosen poverty over prosperity, humility over ambition. How could bricks and bitumen bear souls to realms where only spirits purified by celestial fire may ascend? Their monument fell because it was founded on flesh rather than spirit. Gregory of Nazianzus developed the theme further, showing how Babel illustrated the necessity of sacred initiative in bridging the gap between mortal and immortal realms. No earthly effort, however unified or skillful, could accomplish what only heavenly condescension could achieve. The incarnation succeeded where the tower failed, because Christ descended to mortals rather than people ascending to the divine. Patristic writers consistently emphasized that the ancient judgment contained seeds of redemption. The same power that had scattered nations in justice would gather them in mercy. The same God who had divided tongues would unite hearts. The same authority that had humbled pride would exalt humility through the gift of salvation offered freely to all who would receive it. For those who embraced the monastic life, the tale carried a special resonance with their path of letting go. The builders had sought to ascend through accumulation and achievement, while monks chose descent through poverty and submission. Where the ancient followers had multiplied their numbers for strength, monastic communities remained small and hidden. Where Nimrod's people had built toward the sky, Christ's disciples dug deeper into humility's valley. In the days of Roman persecution, Christian martyrs drew solace from the tale's reminder that heaven's rule outweighed the might of earth. Though emperors claimed absolute dominion, though their legions appeared unconquerable and their monuments everlasting, their power was no more secure than the unity once broken at Shinar and the tower left unfinished. From the minarets of Damascus to the synagogues of Babylon, from the scriptoriums of Constantinople to the caves where hermits copied sacred texts, the story of humanity's first great rebellion echoed through centuries like thunder rolling between mountains. Long after the last brick had crumbled from Shinar's plain, long after merchants ceased to bring fragments as relics to distant markets, the tale of the tower that reached toward heaven lived on in the collective memory of three great traditions descended from Abraham's covenant. Islamic scholars, inheriting both Hebrew scriptures and their own revelations, transformed Nimrod from mere king into history's first tyrant, the prototype of every ruler who dared claim divinity for himself. In the madrasas of Baghdad and Cordoba, teachers spoke of how the tower's builder had not merely sought to reach the celestial realm, but to wage outright war upon Allah himself. According to their accounts, Nimrod had commissioned craftsmen to construct a flying machine from the monument's summit, planning to loose arrows at heaven's gates while proclaiming himself equal to the creator of all worlds. See how pride corrupts even the mightiest, taught Al-Tabari, as he compiled histories that would be read for centuries. Nimrod possessed strength that made giants tremble, wisdom that encompassed all earthly knowledge, wealth that could buy kingdoms. Yet these very gifts became the instruments of his downfall, for he forgot that all power flows from Allah alone. The confusion of tongues was mercy wrapped in judgment, preventing him from achieving a victory that would have damned him eternally. The Quranic commentators, though their holy book did not mention the tower directly, wove the story into their understanding of how divine justice operates in history. They spoke of jinn who had whispered dangerous knowledge to the builders, promising them secrets of creation if they could pierce the lowest heaven. These demons had taught mortals to mix bitumen with metals unknown to earlier ages, to calculate stresses that defied natural law, to organize labor on scales that rivaled the construction of paradise itself. Ibn Kathir, writing in the shadow of the Crusades, drew parallels between Nimrod's rebellion and the struggles of his own time. Just as the ancient king sought to storm heaven through architecture, he observed, so do the enemies of Islam attempt to conquer the faithful through force of arms. Both efforts are doomed to fail, for Allah permits no rival to his sovereignty, whether that challenge comes through towers that pierce the sky or armies that cross the earth. Medieval Jewish mystics approached the story through the lens of Kabbalah, seeing in the linguistic fracture a shattering of divine speech itself, that paralleled the breaking of vessels that had occurred during creation. Rabbi Isaac Luria taught that the 70 languages born from the confusion were actually 70 sparks of the original word, scattered across the nations like fragments of a broken mirror that had once reflected the perfect unity of Eden's tongue. Each people received a portion of the sacred language, he explained to students gathered in Saft's stone chambers, but no single nation can comprehend the whole. The gathering of these linguistic fragments through study and prayer will herald the coming of Messiah, when understanding will be restored and all humanity will again speak with one voice, not in rebellion as at Babel, but in worship as in paradise. The mystics developed elaborate systems showing how Hebrew contained elements of all languages, how the 22 letters of their alphabet were the building blocks from which the 70 tongues had been constructed. They taught that through proper meditation on these letters, through understanding the numerical values hidden within words, a devoted scholar might glimpse the unity that had been lost when God scattered the nations across the face of the earth. Rabbi Eleazar of Worms wrote extensively about the tower's spiritual dimensions, arguing that its 7 levels corresponded to the 7 heavens through which the soul must ascend to reach the divine presence. The builder's error was not in seeking to climb, he taught, but in using material means to achieve spiritual goals. No structure built of brick and mortar can carry souls to realms accessible only through repentance and righteousness. Christian monastics, laboring in scriptoriums from Ireland to Ethiopia, preserved and illuminated manuscripts that depicted the tower in ways that would have astonished its original builders. Their illustrations showed the structure not as mere architecture, but as cosmic symbol, its base rooted in Earth's corruption, while its summit dissolved into clouds that concealed the throne of the Almighty. Angels descended its sides carrying scrolls that bore the names of the scattered languages, while at its peak sat a figure that might have been Nimrod or might have been Pride itself, crown tilted askew as divine judgment fell like lightning from above. The illuminators embedded layers of meaning into every detail. The bricks were inscribed with symbols representing human arts and sciences, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, architecture, all the knowledge that mortals had accumulated since leaving Eden. The mortar between them gleamed black as sin, binding achievements together with pride that transformed virtues into instruments of rebellion. Workers depicted around the base bore the faces of all nations, showing how the confusion had scattered not just languages, but peoples across every continent. Brother Thomas of Aquino, walking the cloistered halls of medieval Paris, incorporated Babel into his systematic theology as the perfect illustration of how natural reason, however sophisticated, could not bridge the gap between created and creator. The tower represented the highest achievement possible to unaided human intellect, impressive in scale, ingenious in design, yet ultimately incapable of reaching the supernatural realm, accessible only through divine grace. The builders possessed everything except the one thing needful, he wrote in margins that would be studied by generations of scholars. They had unity without charity, purpose without humility, strength without wisdom. Their tower fell not because their engineering was flawed, but because their foundation was pride rather than love. Folk traditions across the Mediterranean world preserved fragments of the story in forms that often bore little resemblance to the scriptural account, yet somehow captured its essential truth. Mothers taught children that the babbling of infants echoed the confusion that had once struck down the mighty, while merchants explained the difficulties of trade across linguistic barriers, by referencing the judgment that had fallen upon those who presumed to be their own saviors. In the souks of Morocco and the forums of Constantinople, In the alehouses of London and the squares of Venice, storytellers wove the ancient tale into contemporary concerns, showing how each generation faced its own temptation to build towers that might carry them beyond their proper station. The names changed, the details varied, but always the pattern remained the same. Unity leading to ambition, ambition to overreach, overreach to judgment that scattered what pride had attempted to gather. Thus, the tower that had sought to make a name that would echo through eternity achieved immortality in ways its builders never imagined. Not as monument to human achievement, but as warning about human limitation. Not as bridge between earth and heaven, but as reminder of the gulf that only divine mercy could span. The story lived on in sacred memory. Each tradition understood it through the lens of their own encounter with the divine, yet all recognized in Nimrod's broken dream a reflection of their own deepest longings and most dangerous delusions. The plain of Shinar lay empty now, save for wind and wild beasts. Yet the tower rose eternal in the realm of story, where brick and bitumen had given way to words and memory, where the confusion of tongues had become the clarification of truth. In synagogue and mosque, in cathedral and hermitage, the children of scattered Babel gathered to remember the day when humanity reached too high, and learned, in falling, the proper measure of mortal ambition beneath the infinite dome of heaven's unchanging sovereignty.